Okay, our last day of notes for chapters 11 through 15 is the opposite of our last set of notes. Last was life in the north. This is life in the south. When we said in the north, the biggest job were for factory workers. In the south, they did not have very many factories because they had better land for farming. It was warmer longer, and they had slaves. So they had these huge plantations with slaves working in the fields. Now, when I think of slavery, I just think of plantation, then next to it another plantation, and just plantations everywhere with a bunch of slaves, and that's all that's going on there. There were lots of slaves, but it wasn't how I always pictured it. In order to be a plantation, it had to be owned by a planter. In order to be a planter, you had to own over 20 slaves. So I always ask, how many planters do you think there were? Like one out of every, how many farmers were planters? And I usually get people saying, one out of every three or one out of every four. And that's probably what I would have thought. But it's actually about one out of every 30 farmers were planters. So there weren't a lot of huge plantations. Most of the farms had only one or two slaves to help on their family farm. Now, here's another thing I always ask. Do you think it'd be better to be a slave on a huge plantation where there's a bunch of you, or do you think it'd be better if you work for like a small family farm? And I always get good answers. People say, well, there's more people to be around and probably less work if you're on a big plantation. And I get that. I think it's the other way. I always think it's a family farm. And the reason I say family farm is because I think it would be better if you are, if there's only two people there, you're the only, or two slaves, or only one slave and you're it. Well, if something happens to you, if you get sick, hurt, die, or whatever, that's going to leave the owner with nothing. It'd be like if I had, you know, 30 candy bars and I lost one. Well, I still have 29 candy bars. Well, what if I only had one candy bar and I lost it? Now I don't have a candy bar. So I think you're treated better if you're on a small farm. You have to work a little harder, but I think you're going to be treated better. So what I want you to do is I want you to type in or write in, depends if you have the note sheet or the on the computer. But right here, I want you to just write in whether you would want to be in a plantation or a family farm. You just have to write plantation or a family farm, one or the other. African Americans in the South, they were mostly slaves, but many were free, and they would get their freedom because their ancestors were free, or they bought their freedom. Um, you may say, how do you get money? There were different ways to get money. Some owners even paid their slaves, but not very many. But there were some different things that could happen to help them get money. But for the most part, they were not free. And those that were not well liked in the South. Why? Well, you might think because they're black. Well, yeah, but why? Why specifically were they not liked? And they were thought to be a bad influence. They thought, hey, these people are black and they're walking around, and that's going to make my slave feel like they should be free too because this person's free. So they thought they were a bad influence on the slaves, so they were just not well liked by anybody. Life for slaves, children worked up to 14 hours a day. The men and women can work up to 16 hours a day. The men were usually in the fields. The women were, for the most part, maids or they were cooks. They were kept very busy. In the book Chains, you kind of read a little bit about slave life, and this was, 75 years after Chains, but it's still the same thing, and maybe even a little bit worse. The people that owned slaves had things called slave codes, and there were four slave codes. The first is they cannot gather in a group of more than three. Why? Well, they might be able to plan an escape or try to a rebellion, try to overthrow the leader. The slaves could not leave without permission from their owner, which makes sense. Slaves could not carry weapons, which makes sense. And slaves could not learn how to read and write. They don't want them to be able to read or write, so they can't contact other people in other places and maybe figure out what's going on or figure out a way to rebel or overthrow or do something. So why do they have these? They wanted to keep the slaves as uneducated as possible. They wanted to keep them where they weren't able to think critically. They wanted to keep them to where they had to stay where they were and they didn't know any better. Most of the slaves were religious. The preachers would preach and they would emphasize that there's hope in the future. Life in heaven will be better than life you have here on earth. And that's really all they had to look forward to was dying and going to a better place because their life on earth was so bad. There were some slaves that were able to revolt, have a revolution. Not all of the slaves, obviously, but some did escape. Um, and there were people, black people and white people, that wanted slavery abolished. Abolished means to get rid of. And they were known as abolitionists. So they were abolitionists, people that wanted to totally get rid of slavery. Well, one of the most famous abolitionists was a woman by the name of Harriet Tubman. She led what is called the Underground Railroad. And this is not a subway or anything like that. It's not actually underground. It's not actually a railroad. But what it was a bunch of abolitionists that secretly helped slaves to get to freedom. They would guide slaves to stations, which they could stay overnight to continue their path to freedom. And a station would be like, okay, you're going to go up 2 miles to the north, and you're going to see a house with a blue something on the front porch. Knock 4 times on the door. And then they're going to tell them where to go next, or give them some food, or give them a place to stay, or do something like that to continue their path to freedom. Harriet Tubman was the most famous leader of the Underground Railroad. There's a very good movie called Harriet that's out. In her lifetime, she helped lead over 300 slaves to freedom. And included in this, near one of her last missions, she helped her family, her parents, get their freedom. And there were some, like we said, rebellions, some revolutions. The most famous was Nat Turner's rebellion. He got a bunch of slaves together and they went after the slave owners, and they actually killed 57 whites, or 50, yeah, 57 whites. But many blacks were killed as well, and including those among the dead was Nat Turner. So this is all leading up to, north is no slaves, factories, south is slaves, um, farms, and that kind of thing. And there's starting to be conflict between the two sides. And that's where we're going to head with our next couple of chapters. But that's the end of the notes for chapters 11 through 15.